Frank Morrison's weathered hands froze on the GPS device, his morning coffee growing cold as the terrible truth crystallized before him. The German shepherd he'd pulled from Clearwater Lake 6 months ago, the dog that had become his reason for living, wasn't lost. He was bait. Doctor. Sarah Chen's voice cracked over the phone line as she read the microchip data aloud, each coordinate marking another missing person case spanning 8 years across 3 states. Frank's coffee cup slipped from numb fingers, shattering against the cabin floor as Ranger, beautiful, loyal Ranger, lifted his intelligent brown eyes with what Frank now recognized wasn't devotion. It was guilt. "Sweet Jesus," Frank whispered, his Vietnam-trained instincts screaming danger as he stared at the dog who'd slept at his feet every night since the rescue. Martha's voice echoed from memory. "Sometimes the things we love most are the things that hurt us deepest." How many families had never seen their loved ones again because someone like Frank had shown kindness to this perfectly trained weapon? Leave a like and share your thoughts in the comments along with the city you're watching from now. Let's continue with the story. The cabin that Frank Morrison called home sat like a forgotten prayer on the edge of Clearwater Lake, its weathered cedar siding bearing witness to 3 years of a man learning to live alone. At 67, Frank carried the quiet dignity of someone who'd seen too much and lost more than his share, his silver hair still military short, despite retiring from civilian life after Martha's passing. The Purple Heart gathering dust on his mantelpiece told only part of his story, the visible part that neighbors respected from a safe distance. Frank's world had shrunk to the size of his grief after Martha lost her battle with pancreatic cancer. Their modest 2-bedroom house in town had been sold to pay medical bills that insurance wouldn't cover, leaving him with this one-room cabin and memories that felt heavier than his old Army rucksack. The $1,247 monthly Social Security check covered beans and rice, generic coffee, and the cheapest cuts of meat from Hannigan's Market, where Mrs. Hannigan always slipped an extra can of soup into his bag when she thought he wasn't looking. "Martha always said I had too much love with nowhere to put it," Frank would tell the framed photograph on his nightstand each morning, the ritual as fixed as his black coffee and day-old newspaper. They'd never had children. 2 miscarriages had closed that door with gentle finality, but Martha had filled their house with stray cats, wounded birds, and dreams of opening an animal sanctuary someday. "When we retire, Frank," she'd promised during her chemotherapy sessions, "we'll save all the forgotten ones." The lake had become Frank's confessor and companion, its surface reflecting his solitude back at him during long afternoon walks. He'd developed the habit of talking aloud to fill the silence, addressing the water, the pine trees, even the occasional deer that watched him with careful eyes. His neighbors, the Hendersons, lived a quarter-mile through the woods and checked on him with the careful politeness of people who respected privacy but worried about an old man living alone. Some mornings, Frank would sit on his dock with Martha's ashes in their simple urn, sharing coffee and conversation as if she might respond. He'd tell her about the leaky roof he couldn't afford to fix, the way the silence pressed against his chest at night, and how he sometimes caught himself setting 2 plates for dinner out of habit. The doctor had prescribed antidepressants after Martha's funeral, but Frank preferred his grief pure and untreated. It felt like the last connection he had to the woman who'd shared 42 years of his life. His routine had become sacred: morning coffee with Martha's memory, afternoon walks around the lake's perimeter, evening news with a TV dinner that tasted like cardboard and loneliness. The mailman's daily visit often provided his only human contact, a cheerful wave from someone who didn't linger long enough for conversation. Frank had been measuring his life in small increments, surviving another day, another week, another month without the anchor that had kept him steady since Vietnam. Until that September afternoon when everything changed with the sound of desperate barking echoing across the water. The late September sun hung low over Clearwater Lake, painting the water in shades of amber and gold that reminded Frank of Martha's hair in their wedding photos. He'd been sitting on his dock for the better part of an hour, nursing his second cup of coffee and watching a family of mallards navigate the shallow cove near his property. The afternoon air carried the crisp promise of autumn, and Frank had been considering whether to finally tackle the stack of medical bills still scattered across his kitchen table when the sound shattered his peaceful reverie. Barking. Desperate, panicked barking that cut through the tranquil afternoon like a blade. Frank's head snapped toward the sound, his military instincts still sharp after all these years. The barking wasn't the casual sound of a dog chasing squirrels or greeting its owner. This was pure distress, the kind of sound that raised every protective hair on the back of his neck. He set down his coffee cup with hands that suddenly felt steadier than they had in months, and stood slowly, his arthritic knees protesting the movement. The barking grew more frantic as Frank made his way down the narrow path toward the lake's edge, his worn boots crunching softly on fallen leaves. Through the late afternoon light, he could see the source of the commotion about 50 yards offshore, a large German shepherd thrashing desperately in the water, trapped beneath a massive pine branch that had apparently fallen during the previous night's windstorm. The dog's dark head bobbed above the surface, but Frank could see the animal was losing strength fast, its movements becoming more labored with each passing second. "Well, I'll be damned," Frank muttered, already pulling off his flannel shirt despite the September chill. The water temperature would be brutal, maybe 52 degrees, and his 67-year-old body wasn't built for heroics anymore. His lower back had been giving him trouble since the rain started, and Martha used to joke that he creaked like old floorboards when he got out of bed. But that dog was going to drown if someone didn't act fast, and Frank was the only someone around. He kicked off his boots and waded into the lake, the cold water hitting him like a physical blow. "Jesus, Mary, and Joseph!" he gasped, his breath coming in sharp puffs as the icy lake water soaked through his jeans. The rocky bottom was slippery with algae, and each step required careful consideration as he made his way toward the struggling animal. The dog had stopped barking now, conserving energy, but Frank could see intelligence in those dark brown eyes. This wasn't just panic, it was calculated survival instinct. The pine branch was heavier than it looked, waterlogged and stubborn, requiring Frank to brace his feet against the lake bottom and use leverage he hadn't needed since his army days. His muscles screamed in protest, his back sent warning shots of pain up his spine, but somehow he managed to lift one end of the branch enough for the dog to wiggle free. The German shepherd immediately swam toward him, not away, and Frank felt a strange warmth in his chest despite the freezing water. Getting back to shore proved more challenging than Frank had anticipated. The dog was exhausted, barely able to keep its head above water, and Frank found himself essentially towing 90 pounds of waterlogged animal while fighting his own battle against hypothermia. By the time they reached the shallow water near his dock, Frank's teeth were chattering so hard he could barely think straight, and the dog had gone limp with exhaustion. Frank dragged the German shepherd onto the narrow beach beside his dock and immediately began checking for signs of life. The dog's breathing was shallow but steady, its coat a beautiful sable and black that reminded Frank of his old army working dogs in Vietnam. This was a magnificent animal, well-fed, muscular, clearly cared for by someone who knew what they were doing. The dog's paws were soft, not worn by constant outdoor living, and its coat had the healthy shine that came from quality food and regular grooming. "Come on, boy," Frank whispered, gently pressing on the dog's chest to help expel water from its lungs. "Don't quit on me now." The German shepherd coughed violently, expelling lake water and mucus, then opened its eyes and looked directly at Frank with an expression he would later swear contained gratitude. Those intelligent brown eyes seemed to say thank you in a language older than words, and Frank felt something shift in his chest, a loosening of the tight knot of loneliness that had lived there since Martha's funeral. Frank wrapped the shivering dog in Martha's old quilt, the one she'd made during her chemotherapy treatments when her hands needed something to do besides worry. The German Shepherd accepted the comfort without resistance, even allowing Frank to check for injuries or identification. No collar, no tags, no obvious signs of ownership except for the excellent condition of the animal itself. This was someone's beloved pet, Frank was certain, probably lost during a hiking trip or camping adventure gone wrong. As evening approached and no one came searching, Frank made a decision that felt both inevitable and terrifying. "Well, boy," he said, scratching behind the dog's ears as they sat together on the dock, "looks like you're staying for dinner." "Martha would have boxed my ears if I left you out here alone." The German Shepherd leaned against Frank's leg with a contentment that felt like coming home, and for the first time in 3 years, Frank Morrison didn't feel completely alone in the world. 3 months had transformed Frank Morrison's world in ways he hadn't thought possible at his age. The German Shepherd he'd named Ranger had become more than a companion. He'd become Frank's reason for getting up each morning, his conversation partner during long afternoon walks, and the warm presence that made the cabin feel like home again, instead of just a place to wait for death. Ranger seemed to understand Frank's routines instinctively, sitting patiently by the coffee pot each morning while Frank talked to Martha's photograph, following him to the mailbox without needing a leash, and settling at Frank's feet each evening while he watched the news. The transformation hadn't gone unnoticed in town. Mrs. Henderson from the general store commented on how Frank's eyes had brightened, how he'd started buying better groceries again instead of just the cheapest options. "That dog's been good for you, Frank," she'd said while ringing up premium dog food that cost more than Frank usually spent on his own meals for a week. "Haven't seen you smile like that since Martha was alive." It was true. Frank found himself humming old songs while preparing Ranger's meals, looking forward to their walks instead of dreading the empty hours. But Ranger wasn't just any rescued dog, and Frank had begun to notice things that didn't quite add up. The animal knew commands in what sounded like German, responding instantly to words Frank didn't recognize but somehow understood meant sit, stay, and watch. Ranger's behavior around certain parts of town was puzzling too. He would become agitated near the old industrial district, hackles raised and body tense, as if sensing danger that Frank couldn't perceive. Most troubling was Ranger's reaction to white vans or trucks. The dog would position himself protectively between Frank and any such vehicle, growling low in his throat with an intensity that seemed almost personal. The decision to take Ranger to the veterinarian had been practical. Frank wanted to ensure his new companion was healthy and up to date on vaccinations. Dr. Sarah Chen's clinic in downtown Cedar Falls was a 20-minute drive through winding mountain roads, and Ranger had ridden calmly in the passenger seat of Frank's old pickup truck, occasionally resting his large head on Frank's shoulder in a gesture of trust that made the old man's heart swell with unexpected happiness. "He's a beautiful animal," Dr. Chen had said during the examination, her skilled hands checking Ranger's teeth, eyes, and coat. "Excellent condition, clearly well trained." "Have you checked for a microchip?" Frank had assumed there wouldn't be one. Surely if Ranger had been microchipped, his original owners would have found him by now. But Dr. Chen's scanner had beeped insistently when passed over Ranger's shoulder blade, and the display showed a registration number that made her frown. The microchip led to a name and address that struck Frank like a physical blow. David Chen, Dr. Sarah's younger brother, listed as deceased 2 years prior in an automobile accident on Highway 34. Frank watched Dr. Sarah's face drain of color as she stared at the scanner display, her professional composure cracking to reveal raw confusion and something deeper, a flicker of fear that made Frank's stomach clench with sudden dread. "David loved dogs," Dr. Sarah whispered, her voice barely audible in the sterile examination room. "He worked with a canine training program for troubled youth before he died, but this doesn't make sense, Mr. Morrison. David's been dead for 2 years. How could his dog still be—" She trailed off, staring at Ranger as if seeing him for the first time. The German shepherd sat perfectly still, those intelligent brown eyes moving between Frank and Dr. Sarah with an awareness that seemed almost human. Frank felt his world tilting off its axis as Dr. Sarah pulled up records on her computer, her fingers trembling slightly as she typed. "David was driving home from the training facility when his car went off the mountain road," she explained, her voice growing steadier as she focused on facts. "They found his body in the wreckage 3 days later. The funeral was closed casket because of the damage from the fire." She paused, studying Ranger with growing confusion. "But David's dog was never found. We assumed he'd been thrown from the vehicle and died in the wilderness." The implications hung in the air between them like a physical presence. Frank reached down to stroke Ranger's head, the familiar gesture now carrying new weight. If David Chen had been dead for 2 years, how had his dog ended up in Clearwater Lake just 3 months ago? And more troubling still, how had Ranger survived on his own for nearly 2 years while maintaining the perfect physical condition of a well-cared-for pet? "There's something else," Dr. Sarah said quietly, her voice barely above a whisper. "This microchip has GPS capability. It's been actively transmitting location data." She turned her computer screen toward Frank, showing a map dotted with red pins representing Ranger's movements over the past 3 months. Frank's blood ran cold as he recognized the pattern. Every location where he'd taken Ranger for walks, every store they'd visited together, every route they'd traveled was meticulously documented. Someone had been watching them. Someone had been tracking every move they made since the day Frank pulled Ranger from the lake. The comfortable routine that had brought such joy back into Frank's life suddenly felt like a carefully orchestrated performance, with him as an unwitting actor playing a role he didn't understand. Ranger pressed closer against Frank's leg, and the old man found himself wondering if it was affection or something else entirely. Had the dog been protecting him all these months? Or had Frank unknowingly been protecting something far more dangerous? The questions multiplied in his mind like cancer cells, each one spawning new fears and possibilities that made his chest tight with anxiety. "Dr. Chen," Frank said finally, his voice rough with emotion, "I need you to do me a favor. Don't report this to anyone just yet. Give me 24 hours to figure out what's going on." The veterinarian nodded slowly, understanding something in Frank's tone that spoke to the gravity of the situation. As they left the clinic, Frank's hand rested protectively on Ranger's head. But for the first time since the rescue, he wasn't sure who was protecting whom. The drive home passed in heavy silence, with Ranger sitting unusually still in the passenger seat, those intelligent eyes focused on something beyond the windshield that Frank couldn't see. The GPS coordinates burned in Frank's memory like brands, and he found himself taking a longer route home, suddenly paranoid about who might be watching their movements. As they pulled into his gravel driveway, Frank made a decision that would change everything. He was going to find out the truth about David Chen, even if that truth destroyed the only happiness he'd found since Martha's death. The weeks following Frank's discovery of the GPS chip had transformed his quiet lakeside existence into something resembling a detective novel, though the reality felt far more dangerous than any fiction. Each morning brought new questions that gnawed at him like physical pain, and Ranger's presence had become both a comfort and a constant reminder that nothing in his newfound happiness was as simple as it seemed. Frank had developed the habit of studying the dog when Ranger thought he wasn't looking, searching for clues in the animal's behavior that might explain the mystery surrounding his true origins. Frank's investigation had started with late-night internet searches on his ancient laptop, the one Martha had insisted they buy for staying in touch with her sister in Phoenix. The Cedar Falls Public Library's free Wi-Fi had become his second home as he researched everything he could find about David Chen, printing articles and obituaries with the careful, methodical approach he'd learned in the Army. The official story seemed straightforward enough. David Chen, age 34, former police K-9 trainer turned youth counselor, killed in a single-car accident on Highway 34 during a late-night drive home from work. The obituary mentioned his dedication to troubled teenagers and his innovative approach to using trained dogs in therapy programs. But the more Frank dug, the more inconsistencies emerged like splinters working their way to the surface of his consciousness. David Chen's former colleagues at the youth center described him as increasingly withdrawn in the months before his death, obsessed with what he called worthiness testing among the teenagers in his program. He'd gotten strange ideas about loyalty and character, explained former supervisor Janet Walsh when Frank called pretending to be writing a memorial article. Started talking about how society had lost its moral compass, how most people didn't deserve the protection they took for granted. The local newspaper archives revealed more troubling details. 3 teenagers from David's program had gone missing in the 6 months before his supposed death, all during weekend camping trips that David had organized. The missing persons reports had been filed, investigations conducted, but no bodies were ever found and no connections were ever made to David Chen. Frank spread the newspaper clippings across his kitchen table like pieces of a jigsaw puzzle, Ranger lying nearby with his chin resting on his paws, those intelligent brown eyes tracking Frank's movements with an attention that felt almost human. Frank's financial situation had grown increasingly desperate during his investigation, and the premium dog food that kept Ranger healthy cost $47 every 2 weeks, money Frank scraped together by skipping his own meals and letting his prescription medications lapse. His heating oil tank was nearly empty with October's chill creeping in, and the roof leak above his bed had gotten worse, forcing him to sleep on the couch while pots and pans collected the steady drip of rainwater. But every time he considered the practical solution of surrendering Ranger to animal control, the dog would do something that reminded Frank why Martha had always said animals could see into people's souls better than humans ever could. The breakthrough came on a gray Thursday morning when Frank decided to visit David Chen's grave in Cedar Falls Municipal Cemetery. Ranger had seemed agitated all morning, pacing around the cabin and whining softly, but Frank had attributed it to the approaching storm clouds that hung heavy over the lake. The cemetery sat on a hillside overlooking the town, its neat rows of headstones stretching toward the mountain ridges like silent sentinels. David Chen's grave was located in the newer section, marked by a simple granite headstone that read, "Beloved Son and Protector of Children." What Frank found there made his blood run cold. The grave showed clear signs of recent disturbance, fresh tire tracks in the soft earth, cigarette butts that couldn't have been more than a few days old. And most disturbing of all, a small pile of dog treats placed carefully at the base of the headstone. Frank knelt beside the grave, his arthritic knees protesting against the damp ground, and noticed that the earth around the headstone had been recently turned, as if someone had been digging. Ranger sat perfectly still during this examination, his entire body tense with an alertness that Frank had never seen before. The cemetery groundskeeper, an elderly man named Pete Kowalski, who'd known Frank since high school, provided the final piece of this particular puzzle. "Someone's been visiting that grave every week for the past 2 years, Pete explained, gesturing toward David Chen's headstone with a weathered hand. "Always comes at night. Always leaves those dog treats. Security camera caught glimpses of him a few times. Tall fellow, wears a hooded jacket, drives different vehicles each time. Never could get a clear look at his face, but he's consistent as clockwork. Every Thursday night around 11. Frank's investigation expanded into the surrounding counties, using the library's computer system to search for missing persons cases that might connect to David Chen's work. What he discovered made his hands shake as he printed page after page of missing persons reports. 12 people had vanished over the past 8 years across 3 counties, all of them disappearing near hiking trails, campgrounds, or remote areas where they might encounter a lost or injured dog. The victims ranged in age from 16 to 73, but they all shared one characteristic that made Frank's stomach turn with growing dread. Every single one had been described by family members as the kind of person who would stop to help a stray animal. The pattern was so clear that Frank wondered how law enforcement had missed it, until he realized that the disappearances had occurred across multiple jurisdictions, investigated by different agencies that apparently hadn't compared notes. Sarah Martinez, age 19, vanished during a solo camping trip in Roosevelt National Forest after texting her roommate about helping an injured dog. Thomas Bradley, a 73-year-old retired teacher, disappeared from a hiking trail after his wife saw him approach what she described as a beautiful German shepherd that seemed lost. The list went on, each case a variation on the same horrifying theme. Frank's sleep had become fitful and plagued by nightmares where Martha's voice called to him from dark forests, warning him about dangers he couldn't see. Ranger seemed to sense his distress, staying closer than ever, sometimes waking Frank from particularly vivid dreams with gentle paws on his chest and warm breath on his face. During these moments, Frank would stare into those brown eyes and wonder what secrets lived behind that intelligent gaze, what memories Ranger carried from his time before the lake. The financial pressure had intensified as Frank redirected his meager resources toward the investigation. Long-distance phone calls to families of missing persons, gas money for trips to distant counties to examine case files, and photocopying expenses had pushed his monthly budget past breaking point. He'd been forced to sell Martha's jewelry collection piece by piece, each transaction feeling like another small betrayal of her memory. The irony wasn't lost on him that he was bankrupting himself to investigate the dog that had become his only source of happiness. But it was Dr. Sarah Chen's phone call on a rain-soaked Tuesday evening that pushed Frank's investigation into truly dangerous territory. Her voice shook as she delivered information that would haunt Frank's dreams for months to come. "Mr. Morrison," she whispered, "I found something in David's old files from the youth center. He wasn't just training dogs for therapy programs. He was documenting what he called worthiness assessments of the teenagers in his care. And Mr. Morrison, there are photos in these files, photos of some of the missing persons you asked me about." The photographs that Dr. Sarah Chen showed Frank the next morning were more disturbing than anything he'd encountered during his 2 tours in Vietnam. David Chen had been methodically documenting his interactions with young people, rating their responses to various scenarios involving animals in distress. Those who showed immediate compassion received high marks in David's twisted evaluation system. Those who hesitated or showed indifference were marked with red ink and notes about societal contamination and worthlessness indicators. Frank spread the files across Dr. Chen's kitchen table while Ranger lay nearby, unusually quiet and still. The dog's behavior had grown increasingly strange over the past week, as if he sensed that secrets were being unearthed that would change everything. Sometimes Frank would catch Ranger staring at him with an expression that looked disturbingly like guilt, and the old man found himself wondering if dogs could feel shame for things they'd been forced to do. The most chilling discovery came in a folder labeled Field Testing Results. David Chen had apparently been using trained dogs, including what appeared to be Ranger based on the physical descriptions, to approach strangers in remote locations and assess their willingness to help. Those who passed the initial compassion test were then subjected to more complex evaluations designed to measure what David called their worthiness to survive in a morally corrupted world. The methodology was detailed, clinical, and absolutely terrifying in its calculated cruelty. Frank's hands trembled as he read David's notes about elimination protocols for those who failed his twisted assessments. The missing persons cases suddenly took on a horrifying new context. These people hadn't simply vanished. They'd been murdered by someone who saw himself as conducting a moral purification of society. And Ranger, beautiful, loyal Ranger who had brought such joy back into Frank's life, had apparently been an integral part of this nightmare system. The financial strain of the investigation had pushed Frank to desperate measures. He'd stopped taking his blood pressure medication to save money, rationing pills by taking them every other day instead of daily as prescribed. His grocery budget had been reduced to rice, beans, and whatever day-old bread the market discounted for quick sale. The irony that he was spending more on Ranger's food than his own wasn't lost on him, but Frank couldn't bring himself to reduce the quality of care for an animal that had become his entire world. Dr. Sarah Chen had become an unlikely ally in Frank's investigation, driven by her own need to understand what had happened to the brother she'd mourned for 2 years. Together, they'd mapped the locations where missing persons had last been seen, creating a geographic pattern that centered around the mountainous regions surrounding Cedar Falls. Each red pin on their map represented someone's child, parent, or spouse who had simply vanished while trying to help what they thought was a lost dog. The emotional toll of the investigation was evident in Frank's declining health. His weight had dropped 15 pounds in the past month, his sleep was fragmented by nightmares, and his hands had developed a persistent tremor that he couldn't control. Sometimes he would catch himself staring at Ranger with a mixture of love and horror, wondering how many families were still searching for loved ones who had shown kindness to this beautiful animal and paid for that kindness with their lives. Ranger's behavior had become increasingly protective as Frank's investigation deepened, as if the dog sensed approaching danger. The German Shepherd would position himself between Frank and visitors, study strangers with an intensity that made people uncomfortable, and had started sleeping across the threshold of Frank's bedroom door like a furry sentinel. Frank found this protectiveness both touching and terrifying, wondering if Ranger was guarding him or guarding against him, discovering something even more horrible. The breakthrough came when Frank discovered that David Chen's death certificate had been signed by a coroner who had subsequently moved out of state and couldn't be located for verification. The funeral home records showed a closed casket service with only immediate family present, and the cremation had been expedited at the family's request. Frank's military training and investigative procedures told him that something was fundamentally wrong with the official narrative of David Chen's death. Late one evening, as rain drummed against the cabin windows and Ranger lay restlessly by the fireplace, Frank made a decision that would put both their lives in danger. He was going to visit David Chen's grave under cover of darkness, bringing the metal detector he'd bought years ago for hunting Martha's lost wedding ring in their garden. If someone had been visiting that grave regularly for 2 years, leaving offerings for a dead man, Frank intended to find out exactly what was buried there and whether David Chen was as dead as official records claimed. The plan was dangerous for a man his age, especially given his declining health and the remote location of the cemetery. But Frank had reached a point where the need for truth outweighed his concern for personal safety. Martha had always said that some questions demanded answers regardless of the cost, and Frank could almost hear her voice encouraging him to see this investigation through to whatever bitter end awaited. As he prepared for the nighttime cemetery visit, Frank looked at Ranger sleeping peacefully by the dying fire and wondered if this would be the last quiet evening they would share together. The dog had given him 3 months of happiness, purpose, and companionship that had literally saved his life. Whatever truth lay buried in Cedar Falls Municipal Cemetery, Frank was determined to face it with the same courage that had carried him through 2 tours in Vietnam and 42 years of marriage to a woman who had believed that love could conquer any darkness. The confrontation Frank had been dreading arrived on a fog-shrouded morning in late November, when the lake reflected the gray sky like a mirror made of sorrow. He'd been sitting on his dock with his second cup of coffee, watching Ranger patrol the shoreline with the methodical precision that had become both comforting and unsettling, when the sound of a vehicle crunching over gravel broke the morning silence. Frank's blood chilled as a white panel van emerged from the tree line, moving slowly down his narrow access road like a predator stalking prey. Ranger's transformation was immediate and terrifying. The gentle companion who had slept at Frank's feet for months suddenly became something else entirely. Hackles raised, body rigid, a low growl rumbling from his chest that Frank had never heard before. The German shepherd positioned himself between Frank and the approaching vehicle, every muscle coiled with tension that spoke of training far beyond anything a family pet should possess. Frank's hands trembled as he set down his coffee cup, his military instincts screaming danger even as his heart broke at the obvious recognition in Ranger's posture. The man who emerged from the van looked exactly like the David Chen from the obituary photos, except for the eyes. Where the pictures had shown warmth and kindness, the living David Chen carried darkness that seemed to drain light from the morning air around him. He was tall and lean, moving with the controlled precision of someone accustomed to violence, and when he smiled at Frank across the 50 yards separating them, it was the predatory expression of something that only wore human shape. "Hello, Frank," David called out, his voice carrying clearly across the water. "I believe you have something that belongs to me." He whistled sharply, and Ranger's entire body convulsed as if struck by electricity. The dog took 3 involuntary steps toward his former master before catching himself, torn between conditioning that ran deeper than memory and the genuine affection he'd developed for the old man who had saved his life. Frank stood slowly, his arthritic joints protesting the movement, but his voice remained steady despite the fear coursing through his veins. "Dog doesn't have a collar," he said, falling back on the stubborn practicality that had carried him through 2 wars and 42 years of marriage. "Far as I know, he doesn't belong to anyone." The words felt hollow, even as he spoke them, because Ranger's reaction to David's presence had confirmed Frank's worst suspicions about the true nature of their relationship. David's laugh was a sound like breaking glass, sharp and cutting in the crisp morning air. "Oh, Frank, you have no idea what you've stumbled into, do you?" He began walking slowly toward the dock, his movements deliberate and unhurried, like someone who knew the outcome of this confrontation had already been determined. "That dog has been my partner for 8 years. He's helped me identify worthiness in dozens of people across 3 states. And you, my friend, have been under evaluation for quite some time." The words hit Frank like physical blows, each revelation worse than the last. 3 months of happiness, of feeling useful and loved again, had been nothing more than an elaborate test conducted by a madman who used trained animals to lure good people to their deaths. Frank thought of all the walks through town, all the friendly interactions with neighbors who had commented on his improved spirits, all the nights he'd fallen asleep with Ranger's warm weight against his legs, and realized that every moment had been orchestrated and observed. "You see, Frank," David continued, now close enough that Frank could see the calculated coldness in his eyes, "most people fail my assessments. They show initial compassion, rescue a drowning dog, take in a stray, but when tested further, they reveal their true selfishness. They prioritize their comfort over genuine sacrifice. They choose convenience over character." His voice carried the fervor of someone explaining a religious revelation. "But you've been different. You've chosen to feed Ranger even when you couldn't afford to feed yourself. You've given him your deceased wife's quilt, slept on a leaking floor rather than deny him comfort. Frank's mind reeled with the implications of David's words. The GPS tracking hadn't just been surveillance. It had been documentation of every choice Frank had made, every sacrifice he'd performed for Ranger's welfare. The dog treats at the cemetery, the regular visits to a fake grave, the careful orchestration of Ranger's rescue. It had all been part of an elaborate psychological experiment designed to measure Frank's capacity for selfless love. The question now, David said, pulling a pistol from his jacket with practiced ease, is whether you've truly earned the right to live in the world I'm creating. You've shown impressive compassion, but compassion without wisdom is just weakness. Are you strong enough to do what's necessary when faced with hard truths? He gestured toward Ranger, who stood frozen between them like a living symbol of Frank's impossible choice. That dog has killed 12 people, Frank. 12 people who thought they were showing kindness to a lost animal. Are you strong enough to love something that's been used for evil? Frank felt his world crumbling around him like a house built on sand. The happiness of the past 3 months, the sense of purpose and connection that had saved him from the depths of grief, was revealed as nothing more than an illusion constructed by a madman. But as he looked at Ranger, trembling between his old master and his new family, Frank saw something that David Chen's twisted philosophy had failed to account for. The difference between a tool that had been used for evil and a soul that had chosen love despite its conditioning. "You know what the difference is between you and me?" Frank said, his voice growing stronger as he spoke. "You think love is a test that people can pass or fail. But love isn't about being worthy. It's about choosing to care anyway. Martha taught me that. She loved me through 2 tours in Vietnam, through nightmares and drinking and times when I wasn't worth loving. That's what real love does. It doesn't measure worthiness. It creates it." David's expression shifted from confidence to something approaching rage. "Your wife failed her assessment, Frank. She discovered my work and threatened to expose it. I gave her every opportunity to prove her worthiness, but she chose to side with a corrupt system that protects the undeserving. She died because she couldn't understand that some people simply don't deserve the breath in their lungs." The revelation hit Frank like a sledgehammer to the chest. Martha hadn't died of cancer. She'd been murdered by this monster because she'd discovered his killing spree and tried to stop it. The months of watching her waste away, the medical bills that had bankrupted them, the peaceful passing he'd believed had been a mercy, all of it had been orchestrated lies. Martha had been fighting for justice, even as Frank had believed she was fighting for her life. Ranger made a sound Frank had never heard before, a whine that sounded almost like weeping, and the old man realized that the dog had been carrying this terrible knowledge for months. Every gentle touch, every moment of companionship, every night spent sleeping trustingly beside Frank had been shadowed by the dog's understanding of what his presence truly meant. Ranger hadn't just been rescued from the lake. He'd been seeking sanctuary from a master who had perverted his natural loyalty into an instrument of death. "Choose carefully, Frank," David said, raising the pistol with steady hands. "I can kill you now and reclaim my property, or you can prove your worthiness by helping me complete my work. There are still too many undeserving people in this world, too many who take without giving, who consume without contributing. Help me identify them, and you can live. Choose sentiment over truth, and join your wife in whatever afterlife awaits the morally weak." Frank looked at Ranger, at this beautiful animal who had been tortured into complicity with evil, and made his choice. "I choose love," he said simply. "I choose Martha's way. I choose to believe that every life has value, even yours, you sick son of a bitch, but I sure as hell choose to stop you from taking any more." The morning air crackled with tension as Frank took a step forward, his arthritic hands clenched into fists that hadn't seen combat in 50 years. Ranger remained frozen between them, the living symbol of every choice that had led to this moment, every act of kindness that had been perverted into something monstrous. The fog rolled off the lake like smoke from a battlefield, and Frank Morrison prepared to fight one last war for the soul of the only family he had left. The gunshot echoed across Clearwater Lake like thunder, sending waterfowl exploding from the cattails in a chaos of wings and desperate cries. Frank Morrison lay sprawled on the weathered dock planks, crimson spreading across his flannel shirt, as his breath came in ragged gasps that misted in the cold November air. The bullet had caught him in the shoulder, spinning him around and dropping him hard against the dock railing. But his eyes remained fixed on Ranger, who stood paralyzed between his old master and the man who had loved him unconditionally for 3 months. "You always were too sentimental for your own good," David Chen said, smoke still curling from the barrel of his pistol as he approached the fallen veteran. Martha had the same problem. "Couldn't understand that mercy shown to the unworthy is just another form of evil." His voice carried the calm satisfaction of someone who had solved a particularly irritating problem, and Frank felt a rage building in his chest that burned hotter than the bullet wound in his shoulder. Ranger trembled visibly, caught between ingrained conditioning and something deeper that had grown during his months with Frank. The German shepherd's intelligent brown eyes darted between the two men, his body language screaming internal conflict as David's presence triggered responses that had been beaten into him through years of brutal training. Frank could see the war being fought behind those loyal eyes, and his heart broke for the animal who had been forced to choose between survival and love so many times before. "Come here, Ranger," David commanded in German, his voice taking on the harsh authority that had shaped the dog's early life. "Zeit zu arbeiten." "Time to work." The German shepherd took one involuntary step forward, then another, his body moving against his will as years of conditioning overrode months of genuine affection. Frank watched in agony as the companion who had saved his life slowly walked away from him, each step another nail in the coffin of everything beautiful that had grown between them. But as Ranger reached David's side, something unexpected happened. Instead of the submissive posture David expected, the German shepherd began to shake, not with fear, but with what Frank recognized as barely contained rage. Ranger's lips pulled back to reveal teeth that Frank had never seen bared in anger, and a growl rumbled from his chest that sounded like distant thunder promising a storm. "You ruined him," David snarled, backhanding the dog across the muzzle with casual cruelty that made Frank's vision go red with fury. 3 months with a bleeding heart and you've contaminated years of perfect training. No matter. We'll start fresh with new subjects. There are always more dogs and always more fools willing to die for them." He raised the pistol toward Frank's head, and the old veteran found himself strangely calm as he prepared to join Martha in whatever came after this life. That's when Frank heard it, the sound that would haunt his dreams and fill his heart simultaneously for the rest of his life. Ranger's bark, but not the friendly greeting Frank had grown to love. This was the sound of an animal choosing love over fear, loyalty over conditioning, family over survival. The German shepherd launched himself at David with 40 pounds of muscle and 8 years of suppressed rage, knocking the killer backward into the shallow water at the lake's edge. Frank forced himself upright despite the fire in his shoulder, using the dock railing to pull himself to his feet as man and dog fought in the shallows. David's pistol flew from his hand, skittering across the rocky beach beyond reach, as Ranger's jaws found his former master's gun arm. The sounds coming from David's throat weren't quite human anymore. Screams of pain mixed with curses in multiple languages, as he tried desperately to regain control over an animal that had finally chosen freedom over obedience. But the fight was uneven from the start. David was younger and stronger than Frank, and his years of training had included hand-to-hand combat that Ranger's loyalty couldn't entirely overcome. Frank watched in horror as David managed to wrap his hands around Ranger's throat, squeezing with the methodical precision of someone who had killed before. The dog's struggles grew weaker, his brave stand against his tormentor beginning to fail as oxygen was cut off from his brain. Frank's body moved before his mind could catalog all the reasons why a 67-year-old man with a bullet wound shouldn't charge into a fight. He stumbled down the dock, his arthritic legs carrying him faster than they had in decades, fueled by a rage that burned away pain and age and fear. Martha's voice seemed to whisper in his ear as he grabbed a broken oar from the shore. Sometimes love means fighting for what matters, even when you're not strong enough to win. The oar connected with David's skull with a sound like a melon dropping on concrete, and the killer's grip on Ranger's throat loosened just enough for the dog to break free. David rolled away, blood streaming from his scalp, but his eyes held the calculating fury of someone whose carefully constructed world was crumbling around him. "You've just signed your death warrant, old man," he hissed, reaching for a knife strapped to his ankle. "And when I'm done with you, I'm going to make sure that dog suffers for choosing the wrong side." Frank felt time slow as David lunged forward with the blade, his own reflexes too aged and damaged to mount an effective defense. And this was how it would end, not in some heroic blaze of glory, but as a foolish old man who had loved unwisely and paid the ultimate price for his sentiment. He thought of Martha waiting for him somewhere beyond the gray November sky, and found himself almost grateful that the loneliness would finally be over. But Ranger had one last act of loyalty left in him. The German Shepherd intercepted David's lunge with perfect timing, his jaws closing around the killer's wrist with bone-crushing force that made David scream and drop the knife. Man and dog tumbled into the lake's shallow edge, the icy water shocking them both as they struggled for dominance in a fight that would determine not just their survival, but the fate of future victims who might encounter David's twisted version of moral testing. Frank collapsed to his knees on the rocky shore, his shoulder wound bleeding freely and his strength finally failing him. Through dimming vision, he watched Ranger and David thrash in the shallows, neither able to gain decisive advantage in their desperate struggle. The fog seemed to thicken around them like a shroud, muffling their cries and making the whole scene feel like a nightmare from which Frank might wake to find himself safely in his own bed. But this was no dream, and as David's hand found a rock beneath the water's surface, Frank realized that the story of his rescue dog was about to end in the same lake where it had begun. The killer raised the stone above Ranger's head with murderous intent, and Frank Morrison, Vietnam veteran, devoted husband, and reluctant dog owner, prepared to watch the only light left in his world be extinguished by the monster who had already taken everything else he had ever loved. The sound of sirens wailing in the distance provided a cruel counterpoint to the violence unfolding in the shallows, arriving just late enough to witness the tragedy, but too late to prevent it. Frank closed his eyes and prayed to whatever power might be listening that Martha would be waiting for him on the other side, and that somehow, in whatever came after this life, good dogs and good women would be safe from the evil that infected the world they were leaving behind. The rock never connected with Ranger's skull. Instead, it slipped from David Chen's fingers as the sound of approaching sirens seemed to drain the fight from his body, his face transforming from murderous rage to something approaching relief. Frank watched in stunned confusion as the man who had been trying to kill them moments before suddenly went limp in the shallow water, allowing Ranger to pin him without resistance. David's eyes found Frank's across the bloody shallows, and what the old veteran saw there wasn't the calculated cruelty he expected, but something far more disturbing. Gratitude. Thank God. David whispered, his voice barely audible over the growing wail of emergency vehicles. "Thank God it's finally over." The transformation was so complete and unexpected that Frank wondered if he was hallucinating from blood loss. The monster who had terrorized him with casual threats just minutes before now looked like nothing more than a broken man who had been carrying an unbearable burden for far too long. FBI agent Rebecca Torres was the first to reach them, her weapon drawn but lowered as she took in the scene. An elderly man bleeding on a dock, a dog holding down a suspect in knee-deep water, and an atmosphere of exhaustion that suggested the violence had already run its course. She'd been tracking David Chen for 3 years, following a trail of missing persons that had led her through 6 states and dozens of jurisdictions that had failed to connect the dots. The GPS signal from Ranger's collar had finally provided the breakthrough she needed, but nothing had prepared her for what she found in the remote cabin by Clearwater Lake. "Mr. Morrison," Agent Torres called out as paramedics rushed to tend to Frank's shoulder wound, "you need to know that the man in the water isn't David Chen. David Chen has been dead for 8 years, killed by the man who stole his identity and continued his work." She holstered her weapon and knelt beside Frank as the EMTs worked to stop his bleeding. The real David Chen was a good man, a genuine dog trainer who worked with at-risk youth. This man is Marcus Webb, a former police officer who murdered David and took over his life after losing his own family in a car accident. The truth hit Frank like a second bullet, rearranging everything he thought he understood about the past few months. Marcus Webb had been living as David Chen for nearly a decade, using the identity of a man he'd murdered to continue his twisted experiments in human worthiness. The youth training programs, the missing persons, the elaborate system of testing people's compassion, all of it had been Marcus's design, built on the foundation of another man's stolen life and reputation. Marcus Webb lost his wife and 8-year-old daughter in 2015, Agent Torres explained, as paramedics lifted Frank onto a stretcher. Drunk driver hit them head-on while Marcus was working a late shift. He blamed himself for not being there to protect them, then began blaming society for not deserving the protection he'd dedicated his life to providing. He killed David Chen 6 months after his family's funeral and assumed his identity to continue David's work with a much darker purpose. Frank's vision blurred from shock and blood loss, but he forced himself to focus on Ranger, who had released Marcus and now stood dripping in the shallows, looking lost and confused as police officers secured the scene. The German shepherd's intelligent eyes found Frank's, and in that moment the old man understood that Ranger had been as much a victim as anyone else, a tool shaped by trauma and conditioning, used by a madman who had perverted the animal's natural loyalty into something monstrous. "The dog," Frank whispered to Agent Torres as they loaded him into the ambulance. "What happens to Ranger?" The question felt more urgent than his own medical treatment because Frank had come to understand that the German shepherd represented something larger than just his own loneliness. He was a symbol of how love could survive even the most brutal attempts to destroy it. Agent Torres's expression softened as she looked toward Ranger, who was now being gently coaxed out of the water by an animal control officer who clearly understood they were dealing with a victim rather than a threat. "That depends partly on you, Mr. Morrison. Legally, Ranger is evidence in a federal investigation, but given the circumstances and the role he played in stopping Marcus Webb, there might be options. The dog clearly bonded with you in a way that suggests he's capable of rehabilitation." As the ambulance pulled away from Frank's cabin, he caught a last glimpse of Ranger through the rear window. The German shepherd was sitting perfectly still on the dock where they'd shared so many peaceful mornings, his eyes following the ambulance with an expression that looked heartbreakingly like abandonment. Frank pressed his good hand against the window glass, tears streaming down his weathered cheeks as he whispered promises he wasn't sure he could keep. The hospital stay revealed the full scope of Marcus Webb's deception. Agent Torres visited Frank daily, bringing updates on the investigation that painted an increasingly horrifying picture of the past 8 years. Marcus had used David Chen's credentials and reputation to access vulnerable populations across multiple states, identifying potential victims through youth programs, animal shelters, and community service organizations. Ranger had been just one of several dogs trained to approach strangers and assess their willingness to help. But he was the only one who had survived Marcus's increasingly violent methodology. "Your wife wasn't his first victim," Agent Torres explained during one of her visits, her voice gentle but unflinching in its delivery of hard truths. "Martha Morrison was actually his 13th kill, but she was the first one who got close to exposing him. She'd been volunteering at the youth center where Marcus worked, and she noticed patterns in the disappearances that other people had missed. She spent her last 3 months building a case against him while pretending to undergo cancer treatment." The revelation that Martha's illness had been fabricated as cover for her investigation sent Frank into a grief spiral deeper than anything he'd experienced since her supposed death. She had died a hero, murdered while trying to save future victims, and Frank had spent 3 years mourning a woman who had been braver and more selfless than he'd ever imagined. The medical bills, the treatments, the slow decline he'd believed was cancer, all of it had been Martha's way of protecting him from the knowledge that she was hunting a killer. She left detailed notes about Marcus's operation, Agent Torres continued, showing Frank copies of Martha's handwritten journals. She knew he was using trained dogs to identify targets, and she'd figured out that he was planning to expand his operation. Her last entry was about a German shepherd she'd seen Marcus training with concerning methods. She wrote that the dog seemed to be suffering from the conditioning, that someone needed to save him from what he was being forced to do. Frank read Martha's final words through tears that blurred the careful handwriting he'd loved for 42 years. "If something happens to me, please know that I regret nothing except leaving Frank alone. But I believe in the goodness of people, and I believe that even the most damaged souls can choose love over fear if given the chance. The dog Marcus is training deserves better than the darkness he's being shaped for. Someone should save him. Someone should show him what real love looks like." The irony was overwhelming and beautiful and heartbreaking all at once. Martha had died trying to save Ranger from Marcus's abuse, and 3 years later, Frank had unknowingly completed her mission by pulling the same dog from Clearwater Lake. The rescue that had felt like random chance was revealed as something approaching destiny, a final gift from a woman whose love had survived death itself to orchestrate the very connection that would ultimately bring her killer to justice. But even as Frank marveled at the cosmic poetry of Martha's posthumous victory, the practical reality of his situation became increasingly clear. The shoulder wound would heal, Agent Torres assured him, but the emotional trauma of learning that his 3 months of happiness had been built on a foundation of murdered innocence would take much longer to resolve. Worse still was the knowledge that Ranger, loyal, loving Ranger, carried the blood of 12 victims on his paws, regardless of whether he'd been an unwilling participant in their deaths. Frank's nights in the hospital were plagued by dreams where Martha stood in misty forests, surrounded by the ghosts of Marcus's victims, all of them reaching toward a German shepherd who whimpered with guilt he couldn't express in human language. Frank would wake with tears on his cheeks and a certainty growing in his chest that he was facing an impossible choice: keep the dog he'd grown to love, despite knowing what Ranger had been used for, or surrender him to authorities who might decide that a tool of murder could never be fully rehabilitated. The decision was made more complex by Ranger's own obvious trauma. The dog had been brought to the animal control facility pending the investigation's conclusion, and daily reports from the staff painted a picture of an animal in profound psychological distress. Ranger refused to eat, spent hours staring out the window in the direction of Frank's cabin, and had begun displaying symptoms that veterinary behaviorists recognized as canine PTSD: nightmares, hypervigilance, and a desperate attachment to anything that carried Frank's scent. "He's grieving," Dr. Sarah Chen explained when she visited Frank on his 4th day in the hospital. "Dogs don't understand legal proceedings or evidence requirements. All Ranger knows is that he made a choice to protect you, and now he's been separated from the first person who ever showed him unconditional love. The staff says he hasn't eaten in 3 days. He's dying of heartbreak, Mr. Morrison." Frank stared at the ceiling tiles of his hospital room, counting the water stains that reminded him of the leak in his cabin roof, and tried to reconcile the competing truths that were tearing his heart apart. Ranger had been used to murder innocent people, including Frank's own wife. But Ranger had also chosen love over conditioning in the crucial moment, saving Frank's life and helping bring Marcus Webb to justice. The dog was simultaneously a symbol of everything evil in Marcus's twisted worldview and everything good in Martha's belief that love could redeem even the most damaged souls. The families of Marcus's victims began reaching out through Agent Torres, and their messages created another layer of emotional complexity that Frank hadn't anticipated. Some expressed gratitude that the killer had finally been caught, while others struggled with the knowledge that their loved ones had died because they'd shown kindness to a dog. The parents of Sarah Martinez, the 19-year-old who had vanished while camping, sent a letter that Frank read with shaking hands. "We don't blame the dog, Mr. Morrison. Sarah would have wanted us to forgive, and she would have wanted that animal to find peace. But we need you to understand that every time we see German Shepherds now, we think of our daughter's last moments." Frank's discharge from the hospital came with instructions for physical therapy, pain management, and psychological counseling that his insurance wouldn't cover and his budget couldn't absorb. But more pressing than his own recovery was the decision about Ranger's future, a choice that Agent Torres needed him to make within the week. The FBI could arrange for Ranger to be relocated to a federal facility for behavioral assessment, ensuring he would never again be used to harm innocent people. Or Frank could petition for custody, accepting full responsibility for an animal whose past would forever shadow their future together. Sitting in his empty cabin that first night after the hospital, Frank felt the weight of loneliness settle over him like a familiar coat. The silence was broken only by the tick of Martha's clock and the gentle lapping of lake water against his dock, sounds that had once brought comfort, but now emphasized the absence of the warm, breathing presence that had slept at his feet for 3 months. He looked at the dog bed in the corner, at the food bowl still sitting by the kitchen door, at the rope toy that Ranger had preferred above all others, and realized that his choice had already been made. Frank Morrison had spent 3 years learning to live without Martha's love, and he'd be damned if he was going to spend whatever years remained learning to live without Ranger's loyalty. The dog had chosen love over conditioning when it mattered most, and Frank intended to honor that choice, even if it meant accepting the darkness that came with it. Some kinds of love, Martha had always insisted, were worth fighting for regardless of the cost. 6 months after the confrontation that had shattered and rebuilt his world, Frank Morrison stood in the morning sunlight outside the newly constructed Martha Morrison Memorial Animal Sanctuary, watching Ranger demonstrate basic obedience commands to a group of visiting school children. The German Shepherd's tail wagged with genuine joy as 8-year-old Emma Patterson giggled at his gentle response to her tentative "sit" command. And Frank felt his heart swell with a pride that had nothing to do with ownership and everything to do with witnessing redemption in action. The sanctuary had risen from the ashes of tragedy like something Martha might have dreamed during her most optimistic moments. The reward money from Marcus Webb's capture, $50,000 from a grateful FBI, had provided the foundation, but the real miracle had been the community's response when the full story became public. Cedar Falls had rallied around Frank and Ranger with a generosity that restored his faith in human nature, with local contractors donating labor, suppliers providing materials at cost, and families contributing everything from dog beds to volunteer hours. "Mr. Frank," called out Tommy Henderson, the 10-year-old son of his nearest neighbors, "can you tell us again how Ranger learned to be good?" The question had become a regular request during the sanctuary's educational programs, and Frank had developed a response that honored both truth and hope. He knelt slowly beside Ranger, his shoulder still stiff from the bullet wound, but his movement easier thanks to the physical therapy that Medicare had finally agreed to cover. "Well, Tommy," Frank said, his weathered hand resting on Ranger's head, "sometimes good souls get trapped in bad situations through no fault of their own. Ranger here was taught to do things that went against his nature, but deep down, his heart knew the difference between right and wrong. When it mattered most, he chose love over fear, and that choice changed everything." The children listened with the rapt attention that Frank had learned to treasure, their faces reflecting the wonder that came from understanding that even broken things could be made beautiful again. Dr. Sarah Chen approached from the sanctuary's main building, carrying the weekly health reports that documented the progress of their current residents. 12 rescue dogs, 3 cats, and a one-legged crow that Ranger had apparently appointed himself to protect. "The Peterson family called," she said quietly, referring to a local couple whose elderly retriever had gone missing the previous week. "Shadow came home this morning on his own, healthy and well-fed. That's the 4th successful return this month." Frank nodded, understanding the subtext of Dr. Sarah's report. The sanctuary's unofficial mission had expanded beyond simple animal rescue to become a healing center for both animals and humans who had lost their way. Word had spread through the mountain communities about the place where a former victim had become a protector, and people brought their problems to Frank and Ranger with the faith that comes from knowing someone has survived worse and emerged stronger. The transformation in Ranger himself had been the most remarkable aspect of the past 6 months. The nightmares that had plagued his sleep during the first weeks after Marcus's arrest had gradually diminished, replaced by the peaceful rest of an animal who no longer carried the weight of forced complicity. The aggressive responses to white vehicles had faded through patient conditioning and consistent love, though Ranger retained a protective awareness that made him an excellent guardian for the sanctuary's more vulnerable residents. "You know what Martha would say if she could see this place?" Frank asked Ranger as they walked the perimeter fence together during their evening routine. The German shepherd's ears perked forward attentively, a habit he'd developed during their daily conversations. "She'd say we finally figured out what all that love was supposed to be used for." The sanctuary housed animals that others had given up on. Dogs with behavioral issues, cats with medical problems, creatures that had been damaged by human cruelty, but retained the capacity for trust if given patience and understanding. Frank's own healing had progressed in parallel with Ranger's recovery. The grief counseling sessions that Agent Torres had recommended had helped him process not just Martha's death, but the complex emotions surrounding the revelation of how she'd actually died. Learning that his wife had been a hero rather than a victim had transformed his memories of her final months, replacing the image of a woman wasting away with cancer with the truth of someone fighting courageously for justice while protecting the man she loved from dangerous knowledge. The financial pressures that had nearly broken Frank before the sanctuary's creation had been replaced by a different kind of abundance. The facility operated on donations and volunteer labor, but it also generated modest income through training programs and educational visits. More importantly, Frank had discovered a community of supporters who ensured he never went without necessities again. Mrs. Henderson from the general store had instituted a policy of accidentally over-ordering supplies that somehow always needed to be donated to the sanctuary, and Dr. Sarah Chen had waived all veterinary fees in exchange for Frank's help with other trauma cases. The families of Marcus Webb's victims had responded to the sanctuary's creation with reactions that ranged from grateful to conflicted. Some, like the parents of Sarah Martinez, had visited to meet Ranger and find their own form of closure. "Our daughter would have loved this place," Sarah's mother had said while watching Ranger interact gently with a litter of abandoned puppies. "She always believed that animals could teach us how to be better people." Others preferred to maintain distance, unable to separate the dog from their painful memories, and Frank respected their choice while hoping that time might eventually bring them peace. The most profound changes had occurred in Frank's relationship with his own mortality and purpose. The man who had been marking time until death 3 months earlier now woke each morning with specific goals and responsibilities that extended far beyond his personal survival. The sanctuary required daily care, the animals needed consistent attention, and the educational programs demanded preparation and energy that Frank drew from reserves he hadn't known he possessed. "Sometimes I think Martha planned all this," Frank confided to Ranger during one of their evening walks around the lake. "The rescue, the investigation, even Marcus coming after us. Like she knew exactly what needed to happen to turn something horrible into something beautiful." Ranger's response was to lean against Frank's leg with the gentle pressure that had become their silent language of understanding and affection. The most unexpected development had been Frank's emerging role as a counselor for other trauma survivors. Veterans dealing with PTSD, elderly people struggling with loneliness, families coping with loss, they all seemed drawn to the man who had transformed personal tragedy into community healing. Frank's living room had become an informal gathering place where people shared their stories while Ranger provided the kind of non-judgmental companionship that professional therapy often couldn't match. As autumn deepened into winter, Frank stood each evening on his dock with Martha's urn, updating her on the sanctuary's progress, while Ranger patrolled the shoreline with the relaxed confidence of an animal who finally understood his true purpose. The conversations felt different now, less like grief and more like partnership, as if Martha's spirit had found a way to continue her work through the love that connected a broken old man and a damaged dog who had saved each other in all the ways that mattered. "We did it, sweetheart," Frank whispered to the gathering dusk, Ranger returning to sit beside him as the first stars appeared over Clearwater Lake. "We saved him, and he saved us. And maybe that's what love was always supposed to look like, choosing each other over and over again, even when the world tries to convince us we're not worth saving." The lake reflected their silhouettes back at them, an old man and his dog, surrounded by the gentle sounds of rescued animals settling in for another peaceful night in a place where second chances bloomed like wildflowers after rain. Sometimes the most broken hearts create the most beautiful families. Frank Morrison's story reminds us that it's never too late to find purpose, even when life has stripped away everything we thought we needed to be happy. At 67, after losing his beloved Martha and facing a future that felt empty of meaning, Frank discovered that love doesn't diminish with age. It deepens, becoming more precious because we understand how fragile it truly is. His journey with Ranger proves that second chances come in unexpected forms, that healing can happen even after the worst betrayals, and that the capacity to care for others might be the most important gift we carry into our later years. Frank's transformation from a lonely widower counting down his remaining days to a community leader running an animal sanctuary shows us that our most meaningful chapters might still be unwritten, waiting for the right moment of courage to begin. Martha's posthumous victory over evil through love demonstrates that the impact of a good life extends far beyond our final breath, creating ripples of healing that can save lives we'll never know we touched. True wealth isn't measured in bank accounts, but in the warmth of a loyal companion and the knowledge that we've made the world a little bit better. What unexpected rescue has brought new purpose to your later years? Have you ever discovered that what seemed like an ending was actually a beautiful beginning in disguise? Share your stories of second chances and late-life discoveries in the comments below. Your experience might be exactly what someone else needs to hear today.